want to start. Hello, everyone. My name is John Loflin. I'm here to give my presentation on IDEC and Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to go to my PowerPoint. This is my presentation. Since 2005, I've been the Director of Education and Youth Issues for the Black and Latino Policy Institute. This image is an image of our challenges, trying to combine multiple perspectives on democratic education, so democratic education can be more inclusive. And I want us to keep in mind, as we go throughout the presentation, Maslow's hierarchy. And I also want us to keep in mind comments by James Baldwin, a 1960s African-American social activist and writer in the United States. This is not about education at all, it's about power. So he has said this conversation we're having is about power, not education. And he thinks that education is indoctrination for white people and subjugation for Black people. To put this in perspective, it's important that I talk about my background. I grew up in a poor white family in inner city Indianapolis. I went to an integrated high school. That's me, number 56. And I was the first one on both sides of my family to graduate from university. I was graduated in 1967 into a world of anti-establishment actions, the Vietnam War, women's lib, the environment and organic foods, civil rights, and the sexual revolution. What's relevant is that we can't forget there was an anti-establishment movement regarding education, students' rights, Southern U.S. freedom schools, alternative ed and free schools, and the Black independent schools. Each came out of this era, laying the fertile ground for today's democratic education movement. As an educator in the early 1970s, I read Summerhill, How Children Learn, Deschooling Society, and Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I was so influenced by these revolutionaries, I went to graduate school and got an actual degree in alternative education. I wanted to bring learning alternatives to urban children like others were doing. I especially attracted to the Urban League's storefront street academies, which were attracting young Black men who liked to learn, but just didn't like school. These free schools were student-centered, not teacher-centered. They were private, democratic, had learning and teaching options. Since the first free schools were a product of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Schools in the South, I studied the difference, which was that the freedom schools were community-centered and the free schools were student-centered. It was then I became aware of the Black independent school movement, which came out of the freedom school movement. Here's a Harlem independent Black school in Harlem. I was influenced by teachers from teacher-centered education. I admire the libertarian Sudbury Valley concept. It was after the turn of the 21st century, however, that I got introduced to democratic education. And these are the conferences I attended over a period of time. I'm not going to any more right now because I'm broke going to all these conferences here. But throughout these conferences, my perceptions slowly changed. My anti-establishment critical stance towards education became more critical. I saw and presented on the lack of diversity at Aero and IDEC conferences around race, class, and culture. In 2008, I delivered my paper, Barriers to Democratic Education for African-American Children, at the Vancouver, Canada IDEC. I got no attention from IDEC organizers. Let's return to the present breakdown of my theme, IDEC and Black Lives Matter, and look over the 4 characteristics of democratic schools that Yakov presented in a 2020 video titled Wandering School, or subtitled Growing a Liberating Education. He said that democratic education, schools are run democratically. Students have a right to individuality, to individually determine what they learn, when they learn, where they learn, and how they learn. In democratic schools, there is a very close back and forth relationship and communication between adults and students, and the school operates through the lens of human rights. Let's define Black Lives Matter. It's a global movement organized around the survival of Black bodies and Black liberation. To help us understand why Black Lives Matter is concerned with survival, let's have anyone in the audience given or experienced the talk. The talk is where parents or family members warn Black children they have to be careful of the police. Here's some statistics. In 2020, 13% of the US population was Black, 60% was white. In that same year, 241 Blacks were killed by the police, and whites were, the police killed 574 white people. To help us analyze the above characteristics, let's analyze Yakov's statements in Democratic Education in that YouTube video where he said, I think we have hundreds of democratic schools, so it's something that's growing. We are talking about something that the citizens in the world understand, that they need to give their children a different education. And a democratic country must have democratic education. Let's look at the democratic countries in the world. There's a lot of them. And we can see that these are the countries which Yakov believes should have democratic education. But let's compare that with a breakdown of the individualism versus a more collective viewpoint. We see that the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia are the most individualistic countries on the planet. And down here at the bottom, Venezuela, Pakistan are what we're going to term collectivist or traditional families. So it's good to see where people rank. Of course, this is a picture of, again, of the more individualistic countries in yellow and the more traditional countries in. Now I don't see any yellow in Africa. Maybe that's a lot of reason why IDEC doesn't have any schools in Africa. Let's look at this chart, which compares the characteristics of European American culture with the characteristics of collectivist culture. And this is from a book called Closing the Achievement Gap. I didn't make these up. I got this from this book here by Belinda Williams. The main orientation of the dominant culture is things. The collectivist cultures is people. In regard to child development orientation for the dominant culture, it's mainly an individual matter, a la Piaget. It happens in stages, and it's the same for everyone. In traditional families, how a child develops is mainly a social matter. It takes different paths depending on the goals of the child rearing in a particular community. Regarding the cognitive development, parents from the dominant culture emphasize a child's knowledge of the physical world, defining, describing objects, and linguistic communication skills. Parents from the traditional families emphasize the development of a child's intelligence, interpersonal relationships, responsibility for others, and cooperation. So we see a big difference between, I'm going to say, the European Western view that IDEC has as compared to the non-Western view. Let's look at the concepts of intelligence. This is very important. Dominant culture defines an intelligent child as one who is aggressive and competitive. Traditional cultures, an intelligent child may be one who knows how to complete chores for the family. Now, this is a big difference that the IDEC educators must realize about non-traditional cultures and families. Let's look at a school's emphasis on developing the child's potential. Schools in the dominant culture emphasize developing each child's potential. In democratic schools, a child is free to choose what, when, where, and how they learn. Traditional families may perceive this as encouraging undesirable selfishness. This is a big difference between, I'm going to say, democratic education and traditional families. Giving the child that leeway is considered selfish. In fact, I remember a story by Four Arrows at an IDEC conference. Four Arrows told the story of a teacher who challenged students to, he said, I'll give who's ever here every day, I'm going to give them a big chocolate bar. And it happened that only 2 students were there every day. And he gave each one of those big chocolate bars. One just happened to be a white girl, excuse my terminology. And the white girl said, wow, thank you. I can't wait till I get home, go up to my room, turn on my TV, give me something to drink and chomp down on this chocolate bar. The other student who was there every day was a Native American girl. And she opened the candy bar and shared it with everybody in her class. It was considered impolite for her to eat it all by herself. Let's review again the differences between individualist and collectivist cultures. And here's another graph of the collectivist cultures versus the individualistic cultures. Again, the United States, Europe, and Australia are dominant in this area. Let's look at the European perspective on education and how we exist. In an attempt to understand this existence, René Descartes arrives at a single principle: thought exists. Since thought can't be separated from the person, thus the person exists. I think, therefore I am was his big slogan. His first person perspective became the essence of individualism of European thought and culture. Self-discovery, self-development, self-reliance, personal autonomy that IDEC is pushing is part of that legacy. Let's get another perspective, however. Let's look at the African perspective through the Ubuntu concept. Ubuntu comes from the Zulu term, a human being only becomes a human being through other human beings. And I am because we are is that way of looking at that. Dick DeGroote's communal constructivism says this: we exist because we are seen, because the people around us respect us and acknowledge us as a person. And it is an issue that some whites don't have the community, a sense of community that other traditional cultures have. Let's look and see if quantum physics supports Ubuntu. Niels Bohr notes electrons only have properties when it reacts with something else in relationships. When it is not, it's devoid of physical properties. A particle only exists when it's observed. When we look away, it doesn't exist. And quantum mechanics denies a third personal objective description of reality, which I think the European individually depends on an objective point of view. Let's be objective about this. And this is basically saying that it only exists in relationships, our truths. Let's look at some of the challenges due to what we just talked about, to the IDEC vision. Let's look at what we can learn from the traditional collectivist cultures. For example, the US ideal of the self-fulfilled individual can, at the extreme, lead to widespread isolation, alienation, and violence. Hence, an emphasis on family responsibility and solidarity, so intrinsic to collectivist cultures, can impart a moderating influence on our society. We also have this important difference between how I'm going to argue that the IDEC people define freedom as opposed to the traditional families, and in particular, Black Lives Matter, Black Americans. Black Americans want positive freedom, freedom to live where you want, freedom to vote, freedom to travel where you want, and where the IDEC people are concerned with freedom from, basically freedom from government interference on family and school decisions and what children do and what they learn. So it's a big difference that we have to respect. Democracy by traditional families is two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for lunch. They think democracy is a form of colonialism. Cultural minorities as political minorities can't win in a majority rules decision-making system. So if they're in a town in Mississippi and they're a minority, they get to vote, but they're never going to have any power. The families from collectivist cultural minorities themselves aren't that democratic, because we're going to see that they see it as a form of control. And that's why I'm suggesting consensus as a way of dealing with traditional families. We have to remember too that schools are political sites. I'm sorry, all the schools, public, private, government, are political sites. They have a political stance and a political agenda. You may not think you have, but I'm sorry you do. Because according to James Baldwin, we're not talking about education, we're talking about power. Now, politics relates to the public affairs of a community or city. Politics is a set of activities which allow us to make our decision and what we're going to do with the resources and our taxes. And more important, schools are a child's introduction to life in politics, to life in the polis. So schools introduce children to the world of politics, although they don't think so. And that's why I'm encouraging schools, especially schools in minority neighborhoods, Black American neighborhoods, to teach community organization. Let's look how current European families from dominant culture view what schools are for, what democratic schools are for. Trust is important for our school. Trust in our children that they will go to their own, that they will go their own way and make use of the educational options offered according to their individual rhythm. For African-American families and current families in Europe, traditional families, schools have an existential purpose. It's about survival. It's not about trust. Let's look at some conversations I had with some Black American parents who say this concept that Yakov was talking about, the 4 characteristics, these free schools, these democratic schools where students decide what they do, they can't afford free schools. Parents know their kids are not free, white, and 21. Regardless, you are still Black in the US. We do not have resources and power to protect ourselves if we fail. The consequences of failing are devastating. We can't afford free schools. White children are advantaged from the start and can well be more free or leisurely with learning and schooling. They won't pay as much as a price as so-called minorities who may never catch up to their white peers if they don't get the basics. Is IDEC trying to kill American children and youth? African American educators see child-centered and holistic approaches of IDEC as excuses for not teaching any basic skills, setting up minorities for failure, which can be disastrous. If we in America, if we let in Black communities which are under duress and poor and in poverty, if we let children choose what they do, they may not get what they need to survive. Black children and Black families can't fall back on the majority Eurocentric system as well as white children do if their time at a free school is unproductive. Another issue here is reading. Should we allow in America a democratic school that allows children to learn how to read when they're ready? No, is the answer from the Black community, because it's better to be illiterate and white than illiterate and Black. The Black community can't afford to let their children learn how to read when they're ready. They can't let them decide what they're going to be doing necessarily in school, like at a democratic school. Like many cultural minorities and ethnicities, they can't be as free with their freedom as white people can. Consequently, I'll argue making learning how to read is a political act. It's an existential act. It's an act of survival. It's not something that, well, we'll let Billy learn how to read when he's ready. No, that's not going to work in America. And what I'm trying to say is that we have to be more careful about what we say about democratic schools. Let's talk about democracy and power. Remember, James Baldwin said, this is not about power. If we look at closely, for democratic school teachers and families and supporters, a display of power or authority disempowers students. Liberals act under the assumption that to make any rules or expectations explicit is to act against liberal principles and thus the freedom and autonomy of students. This is an unnecessary overemphasis on individual justice, to not only regard social justice, to disregard social justice actually skews what freedom is, because they feel uncomfortable with power. Free and democratic school orientations will not act powerfully and stress injustices to students. This deadens consciousness and conscience, and thus indirectly any responsibility for social issues. We can even look at a conversation I had on email about this with a person who was a founder of a democratic school. The development of freedom of the individual student trumps the social justice activities for the greater good. Hal Sandowski and the Sudbury Valley model have a deliberate stance on not having the school involved in social justice efforts. They believe that such projects are too often an imposition upon the student by adults' perspectives, and so we have no need here for such goings on. So these statements by Yakov had to be put in perspective. Learning things without answers is another point he made. And we have to look at if all democratic countries need democratic education. Let's look at some recommendations. IDEC will make a public statement regarding their stance on the global Black Lives Matter movement. IDEC must understand their own power or assumed privilege due to being from the majority, which they are. Both sides must be listened to, and I contend that it is those with the most power, in this case, IDEC, those in the majority, who must take the greater responsibility for initiating this process. We need a global public statement regarding the stance of IDEC towards the global Black Lives Matter movement. Let's look at the advantages of democratic education for Black. We've been negative, let's be positive about. Black families will have more say in their democratic schools than they would in public schools. Democratic schools offer a chance for self-actualization, not assimilation. They offer a chance for a strength-based learning plan where we try to find the uniqueness of each student. Democratic schools offer an option for families not to have to put their child on drugs in order to get them educated. A lot of students in America with what so-called setting disability have to take a drug in order to get educated. Democratic schools can offer an option to that because it's okay if you don't want to sit in your seat, if you want to run around. Now we have to balance that out in the situation of freedom versus survival, but I think we can. The fact that democratic schools are democratic and practice democracy in school classrooms, again, will prepare Black students for life in a democratic society. Who benefits when Black children do not know the political system and how it works? Democratic educators can take advantage of the fact that Black Americans are also concerned with liberation. Again, the problem is, what does liberation mean for each point of view, for each perspective? Discipline problems are eliminated in a democratic school. Why would students act up in a school that's trying to liberate them? And finally, democratic education must realize that involving Black intellectuals and families in what democratic education is will help to universalize the movement. This did not take place back in the 70s and 80s, but must happen now. Let's consider a democratic Ubuntu school based on I am because we are. This school will be community centered. It'll teach students how to community organize. It'll be solution centered. Let's learn things with answers, the solution to problems we face every day. It will be based on human rights and it'll be democratic. And will follow what the group said, learning should always be in connection with the community, because nothing of what we learn is of value unless it is of significance and to the perseverance and well-being of the community. Here's another suggestion to consider is try to decolonize the democratic education movement, or what we'll be talking about, how to conscientize the democratic education movement. That's what Jerry Hanahan is going to discuss. Another suggestion, we have to look at our colonial past. Those IDEC members from certain European countries must realize that education was used to subjugate and colonize other countries, and that they're leery of what you want to do in regard to democratic education. You might want to make sure that you have a culturally sustainable pedagogy so that traditional families can learn the dominant culture, but not at the expense of their culture. And you look at my paper, Education for Liberation, which has over 600 reads from 48 different countries. We can build a democratic existential freedom school, a community-centered educational school, be community-centered, education for liberation. It'll have an anti-poverty curriculum. The purpose of the school is to get rid of poverty, not to get children out of poverty, but based on human rights. It'll be democratic, and learning how to read and write will be a political act, will be an existential act. IDEC must remember working with hip hop, which is also known as global youth culture, because it is global. what's interesting about hip hop is that it is its own culture. And even for those youth who are a part of a collectivist traditional family, still identify with hip hop. Hip hop identity is more than race. It used to, the civil rights generation thought race was the issue, but the hip hop thinks that you can identify not only with race, but with music, hairstyle, neighborhood, fashion, even food. What we have here is a way to reach students beyond individualistic versus collectivist arguments. Democratic education shares a lot with hip hop. Hip hop is a worldview of those born after 1965. It's about being authentic and social justice, keeping it real, keeping it right. Hip hop models for youth the authenticity they seek. Hip hop is about keeping it real versus busters or posers or wannabes. Hip hop is about clarifying our existence. Check this out. This is a message to our oppressor, not in the hope that he will listen, but with expectations that my own existence will be clarified. By celebrating the Summerhill School, this is what IDEC 2022 is doing. And that's what we're doing now. We're trying to clarify our existence, which is a constant way of being authentic. And we have to realize that keeping it real and self-actualization share the same DNA. Global hip hop culture is shared by members of both the majority and minority European communities. It's a bridge to the students and the youth. Hip hop culture is a critical movement due to its historic and continued orientation towards healing broken families and supporting cultural and spiritual connectedness, resisting and critiquing people, spaces, and systems that promote fragmentation and divisiveness, and fighting literally for a peaceful, restorative, and humanizing existence. It's a movement towards self-actualization. Remember, Yakov said, a democratic culture guards the equal right of every person for self-actualization. Here is Maslow's hip hop pyramid, where bling is at the top, struggle at the bottom, and remember hip hop. So hip hop has these needs, and through this, basically understanding hip hop, I think this is a way for the democratic education people to be more diverse and reach more people. Remember too, see black hair and sagging, or these fashions, they're fashion statements, but they're also political statements. This is all political. Let's look at Bushido, a German Turkish rapper, or School King, an Algerian rapper. His song Liberté is an anthem for Algerian freedom. And how many times have we talked about freedom and liberation in regard to both, in regard to democratic education? So hip hop's right, a part of that. Can democratic education be universalized? All the above being said, the question is, can it be? If no, now what? If yes, do we need to develop a theory of democratic schools like Henning Demore is pushing? Thank you. Any questions?
You're a storm, John. Every time I hear some your talks, I realize that I'm not in this world, I'm in another world. There are so many things I never considered.
Well, you gotta be all like me and Derek. It helps out. We've seen more, we made more mistakes, and we read more books.
But
because you're young. You're on the right track though.
I don't see any hope though. I seem to not see a way to make things better.
If I were in Greece, I would agree, because what you told me about Greece is very conservative. Although it's the home of democracy, it doesn't want the children to practice it. But you're right. Can it be universalized? I don't know if it wants to be universalized. I don't know if it wants to reach out. I think it's more interested in people coming in and conforming to its definitions and joining its movement rather than, regardless, IDEC needs to make a statement about Black Lives Matter.
Are you joining the IDEC meeting on Sunday?
What?
There is the IDEC meeting on Sunday. You're free to join. I can send you the details and you can think about it.
Thank you.
Well, I'm still awake, John, and really thanks a lot for that. I think it's pretty much the second time I've heard it. What I'm trying to clarify in my mind, but we can talk about this more tomorrow, is the connection here between class and ethnicity. Because everything you say about black culture,
American black culture. In particular.
American black culture. Yeah, American black culture.
A democracy.
I see kids, working class English kids. Well, I've talked to you a bit about this. The problem of working class English kids who've managed to get through school pretty much without learning to read. And the idea that it's okay, you don't have to worry about it because they'll teach themselves is rubbish. They'll be disadvantaged for a long time and they'll probably find work where they're not discovered. It doesn't become obvious that they can't read. There's not an awful lot of them, but there are some. And when I came to be vice principal of a school, I was pretty shocked to discover there were maybe 10 kids out of the 150 of the year that was leaving school who'd got through how many years? 14 years of education. And they'd managed to cover up the fact that they couldn't read. And the problem, they'd got so good at covering it up that it was almost impossible to get them to talk about it without getting a very aggressive response because they've been so used to being failed at everything they tried to do in school. And then in a sense, these kids had a sort of culture of tough guys. They were nearly all boys, by the way. That was interesting too. It was the boys who decided or hadn't been helped to learn to read. And getting them to sort of admit it was very, very difficult. And at the time I was involved with this, I was reading Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and thinking how absolutely it applied to these kids. And then as you began to find ways of helping them recognize the place they were in and feel not judged and begin to realize that it wasn't their fault, they'd been put into this place by all sorts of political and social pressures. They began to be willing, in fact, more than just willing, they became enthusiastic to learn to read. And in the few months that I was involved with these kids, none of them actually did leave the school unable to read. But part of the pressure on these kids was not wanting to admit to the ridicule of the more middle class, the more affluent kids, the position that they were in. And so I realized somehow you had to work with the kids that couldn't read and help them realize their situation. But it was also very important to work with the kids who were doing very well at school and were advantaged by all the home background things that they had, without being accused by the parents of making them feel guilty for doing well at school. it was a very, very tricky issue to handle. I don't know whether the situation is more difficult for white working class or for black. I have American black. I have a feeling that the American black has a culture to fight back with that the working class white kid doesn't. But I might be wrong about that. I'm looking forward to talking about this more with you tomorrow.
Well, we have systemic issues, like I said. It's better to be poor, white, and illiterate than black and rich and illiterate or anything. It's better to be white and illiterate than black and illiterate. And you entered gender into this conversation, so that would give us even more. And that's in the United States. I don't know what's going on in other countries.
No, and to what extent the white working class kids in England are a part of hip hop culture, whether they have that as part of their identity, I'm afraid I just don't know.
We ought to. They do.
You do. Great. Well, you can tell me. That's fantastic.
Just look it up. Go and ask. Yeah, hip hop is probably most communities around the world have a hip hop scene. It's a global. It's been around a long time. It's a global youth culture, and IDEC people gotta get into that culture and respect that culture because they share a lot of similarities. Again, Morrow may have a point here. So what? It's just not going to really be a democratic school if it doesn't share the characteristics that IDEC believes is a democratic school. But I'm glad.
Well, this is what we're raising, the question of public versus private, fee paying or free. But again, we can talk about that tomorrow.
Anybody? Looks like we don't. Morrow, you got anything to say? You just look tired.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
Did you have anything to say, or has anybody got any questions?
Oh, no, I don't have any questions. I don't know if anyone from the panel would like to say something. I can see, I cannot see without my glasses. Okay, I can see Calliope, Sabrina, Dottie, Zoe, and Ciderlen.
Well, hopefully the video will be put out by IDEC and later on down the line, or maybe tomorrow when Derry and I talk, people be more involved. I think it's an important issue. And again, IDEC, if it's responsible and has a conscience, it has to give a statement in regard to Black Lives Matter, supporting it or not supporting it. It can't avoid it. Both organizations are global. Both organizations have global responsibilities. And IDEC, since it has more power, is obligated morally to make a statement in regard to Black Lives Matter.
Dottie Myers has had a comment in the chat. It says the Freedom School seem to be an alternative to democratic schools.
Yes. Now the Freedom School is a school that's in between. The Freedom School is more concerned about survival. The Freedom School defines freedom differently than the free schools and the democratic schools. Yakov made a general statement that he couldn't make, that democratic countries need democratic schools. No, you got to qualify that. The United States is a democratic country. You just got to, he's trying to sell the concept, I know, but this could be a way for him to qualify next time when he says that. But yes, she understands. I'm not sure who she is, but she must understand the difference between the Freedom School and the democratic schools. The Freedom School is about survival. The democratic schools are about trust and happy children and You can't worry about that if you're at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, worried about survival. Now, if you're at the top of Maslow, you can worry about democratic schools and Billy walking around and deciding to do what he wants to do. I'm not against that. I ain't mad at nobody, but we have to realize there are situations where democratic schools can work, but it has to be respectful and they have to give up something. And this woman, she's got a link there. There must be some schools in the US that are trying to be freedom schools.
That's the Freedom School in Philadelphia, in the inner city, in one of the, yes,
Hey.
Sankofa Charter Academy. So if you go onto their website, and I also put in the chat, I watched a series called Small Acts, and
Yeah.
it talked about racism problems in the UL, but it should be in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, they're brilliant.
Yeah, that series, I caught it on Amazon Prime, and there was one where a young man was in school, and they sent him to what would have been like a special education school. But you know, that wasn't really the solution.
Dorothy, have we met before at an IDEC? Are you from California?
Yeah, I think I went to an IDEC. I can't remember when.
No, we met. How you been?
Oh, I've been pretty good. I'm substitute teaching.
What do you
I
understand
retired
here?
from teaching special ed, and yesterday, the last 3 days, I subbed in a class of 4th and 5th grade, severely handicapped. Well, they were mainly students with Down syndrome. And the aides told me, I said, well, I think we're going to do an art activity. And I'm no artist, because the teacher had these kids go to the library and pick books, but they couldn't read the books. So basically they were staring at a page with letters on it for like 20 minutes. So we did an art activity, and it was some guy, a YouTube. So the kids drew a fish, and then I had each of them stand up and share their fish and tell what the fish was named. There was also a young lady in there. She's probably 5th grade. And they said, oh, well, she doesn't speak. And I said, well, I heard her speak. And she had, it must have been an iPad mini with some programs.
I'll be darned.
And if she wanted to say yes, she pressed yes. But, and I told the aide, I said, well, she had a conversation with me. And they sort of looked at me like, you have to be kidding. She doesn't talk. And I said, does she talk at home? Well, yeah, she talks at home. She understands. She must be fluent in Spanish, because the aide spoke to her in Spanish and she understood. I was talking to her. But
Hey,
see,
Dorothy, we gotta quit. It's 5 minutes till. That's what I heard.
Dottie, can I ask, are you going to be able to join our discussion tomorrow?
it depends on the time.
3 o'clock US time.
3 o'clock. Is that East? No, I have a funeral tomorrow. I'll try. I'll see. I'm in California, so 3 o'clock is probably going to be about noon.
It is 1700 UTC, 7 p.m. UTC. I don't know if that helps you with the.
Well, I have to convert it on my time converter. I'll try, but I have a funeral to attend tomorrow.
Well, I hope you make it. And thanks for the tip. I've seen that Small Axe film. It's brilliant. But I'm going to see if I can find some time tomorrow to look at it again before we have our meeting, John.
Okay.
Well, I think it was like four or five episodes.
There's
And
4
I
or
think
5.
one-
Oh, sorry.
And I think the first one started out with like the Black Panthers. their movement in the UK. But there's several that I've caught. Every once in a while, I'll go on to the UK TV and see some of the series. What is the area in London where most of your Caribbean
Notting
immigrants
Hill.
live?
Notting Hill.
Notting.
And one of the films is about a famous restaurant, the Mangrove Restaurant. I think the films are about different aspects of Caribbean life in London, and I think there's one about the kid who gets designated as having learning difficulties, and is just sort of pushed down and pushed down and pushed down by the system. That's the one I want to try and watch before we meet tomorrow. It's really been great listening to you, Dottie. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Hey, Mario, I'll see everybody. Thanks for having me, IDEC. I love everybody. And it was an honor to be able to speak my ideas.
Good night, John. Good night, Mara. Thanks
Thank
for
you
everything.
very much. The honor was all ours, John. And we really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Good night or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. See you tomorrow.